to me going on the show. And the host, who very rudely interrupted me, said, "You're not there to speak on behalf on those communities." And I said, "Well, Tucker Carlson, in addition to being a Muslim woman, I am a Black queer person." And thank you. And I had just come out on national television to most of my family, to people all across the world, and to all of my coworkers. And I couldn't put it back in the box. It was the Pandora's box. Everything was out. I could feel my phone notifications buzzing. People were sending me death threats. People were sending me words of encouragement. GLAAD had reached out. Amazing things. But I just wanted to get through the interview. And I think I did a good job. You can check it out on YouTube. Highly recommend. But now I'm kind of the token queer Muslim, and that's not the case at all. There are so many of us. There's Leo Kalian, there's Abdi Lak, there's Fazia Misra. There's so many of us. And today I work with an organization called Muslims for Progressive Values, and we work to advance progressive values of Islam. Values that are very much...
Confused. Very, very, very confused. Hello, my dear friends. Assalamu alaikum. We were discussing the chapter called Surah Tawbah, also referred to as Bara'ah, which is the 9th chapter in the Holy Quran. And I want to have a little bit more discussion on one of the particular verses that appears in this chapter, because it's extremely relevant. It's extremely reminding and instructional in our times. And let me, before I get to the verse, let me first give you a bit of an introduction as to the idea, the phenomenon, the modern day phenomenon that I'd like us to then link with this verse. Now, you have heard often the word, the narrative, the common narrative, or the dominant narrative. I'm sure you've heard it, right? And, my wife said the other day, I'm so sick of this word, narrative. Everyone is trying to just claim or quote and speak about the narrative. So what is the narrative? Why has this concept become so important in our times? First of all, the word narrative means the story. It means the progression, the way the story unfolds. And by means of an introduction, those of you who are social science students would have come across the idea of postmodernism. And postmodernism is really a form of post-structuralism. And post-structuralism, and I don't like using high words and trying to bamboozle you with terminology, but let me just give you an idea. Structuralism is a concept or an idea associated with modernity, right? With the European Enlightenment. And it refers to a time when human beings uphold the idea that the universe and society generally are structured. There is a correct way of structuring society and structuring institutions and structuring your life and structuring systems. So structuralism is the Enlightenment, a concept that emerges out of the 1800s, 1700s European Enlightenment, that refers to the idea that structure is good and that there is an ideal structure that could be aspired to by humanity or by people or by societies. And what postmodernism did, because structuralism is associated with the right way and with the wrong way, right? So if you uphold the idea of structuralism, which is associated with modernism, which is associated closely with science and, positive science, then you believe that there's a right way of doing it and there's a wrong way of doing it. Okay, so that is structuralism. It just means that there's a right way of doing things and there's a wrong way of doing things, and that we should aspire to doing it the right way. So incorporate the right way into the structure that we apply to our lives, to society, to organizations, and whatever. So what is So structuralism is very much associated with an objective understanding of what is right. So we uphold what is right in an objective way, because if you belong to the structure and I belong to the same structure, then obviously we have to have the same ideas of what is right and what is wrong. We can't have you having a different system of right and wrong than me, because then we couldn't form part of the same structure. We'd be working past each other. So an objective idea of what is right is required for structuralism. But now we come to postmodernism, where the whole idea of an objective understanding of what is right is now disputed or questioned. And the postmodernist will claim that any person that is asking for an objective view on what is right or what is true or what is real, those words are all related, right, true and real, that person then has to question the idea of a neutral or an objective statement of what is true. And so there is where enters the idea of postmodernism, is post-structuralism. So it disputes the idea. It finds the idea of an objective understanding of truth to be naive, and that there's really no objective view on truth, and that truth is really what you make of it. And so postmodernism argues that there are multiple truths, that there are many ways, not of seeing truth, but the very essence of truth is different for different people. Now, I will agree, as a critical realist, I will agree that there are many perspectives on truth, but there can't be many truths. Now, that's a very important point. You and me can have a different perspective of truth, but you and me cannot have different truths. So we cannot have a different truth altogether. And postmodernism takes it further than to say that you can have different perspectives. It actually argues that you can have different truths. And so when a postmodernist comes around and argues that a male can turn himself into a female by simply making the assertion, by simply stating it, not any operation, no biological or physiological intervention, nothing, just by saying, I was a male and I'm a female, it is completely acceptable within that postmodernist philosophy. And obviously, come from a Quranic perspective, we cannot but reject this. This is an absolutely rejectionable assertion. Although many Muslims, there's prominent politicians in the US, like Ilhan Omar, they actually, because the subjective view of truth, to say that each man has his own truth, actually creates a comfortable place for any person who has his own idiosyncratic view of truth. So if I'm Muslim and I'm in the US and I'm subject to persecution because people don't believe that Islam is a valid and legitimate expression or understanding, then I would prefer rather the postmodernist view where my religion is my truth. And so what you will find in America or in the West in general now, Muslims are very much buying into the postmodernist idea of Islam, because they then feel protected as a idiosyncratic expression of a truth within a greater system, right? So unfortunately, people like Ilhan Omar and many other people locally, also Muslim postmodernists, really, and my son was telling me the other day that you get these Muslims that actually put their pronouns up on Instagram. And so, it's all buying into this postmodernist, relativist understanding of what is truth. Truth is what people make it. Absolutely. absolutely rejected by the Quran, because the Quran is a statement of objective truth. The Quran postulates the idea that there are universal truths, maybe not 100% understandable or penetrable by our intellect, but we can certainly endeavor to penetrate the truth of the Quran. And so the Quran is there for us as part of a system of truth which we need to endeavor to penetrate and imbibe and absorb. Now, I'm not saying every person has the right understanding of the truth, because there is what is called in the Quran the Lawhun Mahfuz. It is the absolute, undiluted, crystal clear truth that does not go through the filter of the human sense and the human intellect. It is a truth that is pristine and pure, and it is only available once we enter the year after. So in this world, we are unfortunately going to be absorbing the Quran through the filters of our limited senses and our limited intellect. And so that is fine, but it just means that there is a divine objective truth, and we should endeavor to reach it. Now here, let's come to the verse. I think that's enough of an introduction. What the verse states, you see, what the verse states then is, كَالَّذِينَ مِنْ قَبْلِكُمْ كَانُوا أَشَدَّ مِنْكُمْ قُوَّةً. Right? Now, let me first tell you who this verse is addressing. This verse is addressing Muslims. If you don't believe me, go and read Surah Tawbah. This verse is addressing Muslims, the mu'mineen. This verse is not, as many parts of the Quran, addressing people of old. It is addressing you and me. And so it's very, very crucial that we take note of what this verse says here. It says, there is a similarity in those who lived in previous times. They were more powerful than you and had greater wealth and more underlings. Right? And more underlings. And so they took pleasure in what they had amassed. So too are you now delighting in what you have achieved. The Quran is speaking to you and me. As did those before you delight in their achievements. And so you too now indulge in false narratives as they did. For such people we have rendered their actions futile, both in this world as well as in the afterlife, and they will be losers in the end. Now this is a crucial point here, the last few lines, for such people, the last 4 lines. And so you too now indulge in false narratives. كَالَّذِينَ خَادُوا. The word is مِنْ قَبْلِكُمْ بِخِلَافِهِمْ وَخُضْتُمْ كَالَّذِينَ. Look at this. وَخُضْتُمْ كَالَّذِينَ خَادُوا. Now that khuddu or khawada, right? Khawada, the verb, you can go and look it up. It refers to fabricated narratives, to idle, and some of the clergy and translated as music. That's not the translation. Khawada means to spin tales and narratives, right? Now, obviously, you can have a true narrative and you can have a false narrative. What postmodernism is arguing is that there is no such a thing as a false narrative. There's only the narrative, your narrative, my narrative. And so if they approach a situation or an incident, let's take the war in Ukraine, right? The war in Ukraine. They would promote one narrative and make that narrative dominant. In other words, they would identify the bad guy, not necessarily the bad guy in reality, but the bad guy that suits their narrative. And they would identify the good guy, and not necessarily the real good guy, the good guy that they say is the good guy, right? And they will portray or present the conflict in a way that enforces their narrative. So, in other words, the idea of postmodernism is that there's only the narrative, there's no truth, and the one that can dominate, that can create the dominant narrative, really has power. So power is associated with a dominant narrative, which is why Twitter, YouTube, all the media have to, by necessity, enforce the dominant narrative, because if you believe that there are multiple narratives, they are all correct, then you need to suppress narratives that do not entrench or support a dominant power. And so let me again remind you what this verse is saying is that it makes a rejection, a refutation of the idea of multiple narratives. And it refers to it as, it warns us not to fall prey to this concept of multiple narratives and to stick to what the Quran says. The Quran has a very clear understanding of what is true. The Quran's idea of true is that which is real, which is verifiable, which is evidenced. And if we cannot find evidence, and if we cannot verify, and if we cannot rationally explain it, then it cannot be admitted as truth. I hope that is helpful, but I think this verse, a good friend of mine asked me, does this verse refer to music or to idle talk or to humorous talk? No, this verse is very deep. It refers to the idea where people drift from what is objectively true into false mythologies and in fact misguided ideas and understandings, because they abandon the idea of objective truth and they entertain the idea of the narrative. Oh yes, let me just add another interesting point to ponder here. One can now understand the importance of hadiths, how hadiths came to hijack the rational and the evidence-based approach to the Quran. You see, the Quran at countless times tell you to look at the signs of Allah. In other words, study the evidence and reflect on the evidence. Whereas hadith has replaced those concepts, studying the evidence, reflecting on the evidence rationally, with listen to the story, listen to this hadith, listen to this hadith, listen to this hadith. And it has flooded the rational and the evidence-based pursuit in understanding the Quran with multiple hundreds of thousands of fables and stories. And so we can actually link the two also.